Good day. Thank you for joining me on this lecture on the WPA project. I could not begin this lecture on the WPA without discussing the parallels between the 1930s and what we are experiencing in 2020. The year may be 2020, but we can't see clearly. Looking forward, we are confused, frustrated, and overwhelmed by the burdens that face us. The unseen enemy of the coronavirus, the concurrent collapse of our stock market and economy, leading iconic businesses into bankruptcy, and the job loss for millions, coupled with civil unrest, has turned our lives topsy-turvy. A similar situation in our history occurred in 1929, when the stock market collapsed in October, leaving millions holding worthless paper. Everyone was affected in some way, even if you owned no stock. Home foreclosures, bankruptcies, and job loss was unprecedented. Your parents and grandparents have no doubt told you the story of their trials in making ends meet. There was very little to bolster the economy. Meanwhile, the drought in the Midwest led to abandoned farms and lost crops, resulting in the vast Dust Bowl of the 1930s. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected to lead us. It is ironic that we elected a man strapped to a wheelchair who was able, with pluck, a happy demeanor, and the charm of a gentleman suitor, to begin to rebuild our nation and our faith in ourselves. The foundation of a safety net was laid, and programs were constituted to get people working so their self-confidence could be restored. The economy of the world also was suffering at the time. But Winston Churchill in England warned that the Nazi regime in Germany was defying the rules of the Versailles Treaty of World War I. Hitler was creating the greatest war machine that the world had ever seen. But we were rightfully preoccupied with other problems, so Hitler got the go-ahead. Now, in 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and in 1941, of course, we declared war on Japan with the advent of Pearl Harbor. But we were very ill prepared for this war. We had only a 90-day supply of rubber. And our World War I vintage tanks were mothballed. Can you imagine that against Hitler's panzers? The government ordered the Ford Motor Company to begin building tanks. And they asked, well, how do we do it? The government sent them a set of blueprints. They were forced to innovate and to recreate themselves. FDR desperately needed material, everything from fabric, buttons, zippers, and leather for uniforms and boots, and steel for tanks and airplanes. He turned to Sears Roebuck and hired the man who ran their catalog, knowing he had access to the channels for procuring everything. With grit and determination and many lives lost, the war was won. That generation had been molded by the Great Depression and hardened by a world war. But their character and strength had been burnished, and they have been called the greatest generation. We are their descendants, and despite the uncertainty, we too will emerge from this stronger and changed for the better. Now, let's begin talking about the genesis of the WPA. It was authorized by Congress in 1935 and headed by Harry Hopkins, one of the aides to President Roosevelt. The Federal Art Project was part of the WPA, which it stands for Works Progress Administration, from 1935 to 1943, when it was finally disbanded. The artists were employed by the government and received a stipend of $23 to $25 weekly, depending on their experience. They were hired to decorate schools, post offices, libraries, and other public buildings, including Newark Airport, where Achille Gorky did his famous mural, which was rediscovered in the 1980s, covered with 14 layers of paint. It also created the CCC camps and the Federal Works Project, which included roads, and Roosevelt Hospital in Edison, which was initially built as a tuberculosis hospital. The program employed 3,600 artists. It was non-discriminatory. Men and women could apply. 16,000 works of art were created in 1,000 cities across the country. This was the largest government-supported effort to bolster the arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts is also an outgrowth of the WPA. Now, the WPA did not distinguish between abstract and representational art. Both were equally American, but more representational artists were hired. Artists were given the opportunity to paint full-time and develop their style without having to worry about putting food on the table. It also created an esprit de corps as the artists interacted and learned from each other. Much of the work was mediocre, and though it was primarily a relief measure, it was not welfare. Artists and the millions of others employed by the WPA created something, and there was pride in that creation and their work. And it gave everyone a sense of hope and purpose. Many of the artists there were politically active, and I will show you their works and you will see it in those works. The WPA was officially terminated on June 30th of 1943 during the war. Now we're going to start with a discussion of the regionalists. And I'm starting with Thomas Hart Benton, and in a sense I'm going to end with Benton as well, which you shall see in a little while. He was born in Missouri. His father wanted him to be a lawyer, but his mother supported his artistic ambitions. By 1907, he was in the Art Institute of Chicago, studying at their school, and from 1908 to 1911 studied in Paris at the Académie Julienne, which was one of the most famous art academies in Paris at the time. He was uncomfortable, however, never comfortable with the Parisian aesthetics, such as the movement to Cubism and the movement to abstract expressionism. But he met Diego Rivera, who was a mural painter, as Thomas Benton was to become. He returned to New York and settled in New York City and experimented with many styles. He couldn't quite find his footing, if you know what I mean. In the 1920s, he traveled across the United States, doing much sketching and evolving into a mature regionalist style, which you see illustrated here in the portrait of him with his wife, Rita Piacenza, whom he married in 1922. He also became the teacher of Jackson Pollock and of the actor Dennis Hopper. Dennis Hopper was also an artist, and he worked with and studied with Thomas Hart Benton. Benton himself was a very hard-drinking, flamboyant, and opinionated man, and he alienated himself from the New York art circle, where he lived in New York, and also in Martha's Vineyard, where he died in 1975. He was very receptive to Marxist socialist theories in the 1920s, as were many artists. In 1930, he received a commission from the New School for Social Research to do a series of 10 murals, which he completed by January 1931. He received no money for these murals except expenses, and 30 years later, the panels were sold to the AXA Insurance Company and stayed in their lobby until 2012, when they were donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they now hang in the Met Annex on Madison Avenue. Now we're going to start looking at this because he illustrates the full gamut of what was going on in the 20s and 30s. For example, this panel shows one of the prime qualities of Benton's work: dynamic, rhythmic, with a bit of turmoil thrown in. The train, the plane, the turbine, the electric tower, and the dam with an airship is sailing off to the right. The gray molding in the middle of the painting sets the areas of the panel to make them easier to comprehend. Note the train with the huge powder puff of smoke coming out. The train has been attenuated. That is, it has been stretched, leaning forward to give it a sense of dynamism and a sense of movement. He creates a rhythmic, dynamic, compact composition with tactile sensations. That is, you want to touch these things, okay? There is a tactile quality to it. And many bulges and recessions, coming forward, going back, again, adding to the dynamism. Now here is the next mural, which is city activities with the subway. Benton's figures derive from Michelangelo and El Greco. El Greco attenuated or stretched his figures, and it looks here, when you look at these figures, as if they have been stretched a little bit. But also, the contours are very exaggerated. For example, in the upper left, we see the burlesque show, and in the lower left, we see a couple necking on the park bench. The central section shows a revival meeting, which was very popular in the 20s and 30s, and also a boxing match, and you can see the musculature, the exaggerated musculature of the boxers, which of course comes from Michelangelo. The next one is city activities with the subway. Now, here we see a stockbroker in the middle looking at the ticker tape. Of course, it's an allusion to the fall of the stock market. But we also see a dance hall. That is most probably one of those dance marathons which were held during the Depression. Couples would come and dance, and the last two people standing after sometimes 24 hours of dancing was awarded a prize, generally a $10 bill, which was quite a coup if you had a $10 bill in your pocket in those days. Now, now you notice that the bulging musculature of both the men and the women, the exaggerated contours do tend to flatten the figures, and we have also alternate areas of light and dark. Now, these paintings were not done with oil painting. They were done with egg tempera. And it's exactly what it says it is. It's tempera paint, and you mix it with egg yolk, and then you put it on the canvas. Now, the next one. Here he shows a contrast. He starts showing contrasts. This one is called The Changing West. In the top left-hand corner, we see movie making, probably the movie Wings from 1927, which was directed by none other than Howard Hughes. We see oil rig in the middle, industrial welding and turbines contrasted with the right side, with the cowboy and the old Western building and the windmill with the sheep and the cattle ranching. He is interested in capturing the changes in 20th century America. In other words, there was a dynamism of the 20th century which pulled us out of the 19th century. All of this during the Depression and the Dust Bowl. Now, here in the Deep South, we see cotton, a horse and paddle wheeler representing the Old South, but an oil refinery, farm mechanization on the left, and black labor representing the New South. Benton included workers of both races in his murals. There was a broad panorama of the diversity of our nation, which celebrates the American experience. Now, the next one is the Midwest. Here we see mechanized agriculture with grain silos and the logging industry. Benton celebrated the American experience. As a matter of fact, Matthew Bagel, my art professor at Rutgers, compared him to John Trumbull, the painter who painted the history of early America. His works are the ones that decorate the Capitol Rotunda, and you no doubt have seen the painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence by Trumbull. All right, now here is building cities. There we see a skyscraper being constructed. Could it be the Empire State Building? I wouldn't be surprised, because the Rockefellers began building the Empire State Building in the 1930s, never knowing whether or not they were actually going to fill all those offices. But they did it it took about 18 months, and it was done with no loss of life, and New Yorkers would go to see how far up it had gone. It gave people hope. Maybe there is a future, because they wouldn't be putting up a building like that if they couldn't get anyone to occupy it. Now, the right panel here on this also shows shipbuilding with a derrick and skyscrapers beyond. In other words, the dream city. Benton also devoted one of his panels this entire panel is devoted to a building material of the 20th century, namely steel. Not iron, not wood, not wrought iron anymore, steel. which industry thrived until the 1970s when the jobs began to move away. There was a strong contrast of light and dark, which lend themselves perfectly to the subject. Note that one of the steel workers on the right, I think it was the large one, was modeled by none other than Jackson Pollock, who was at that time a student of Thomas Hart Benton. Now, we're going to look at another artist, John Stewart Curry. Now, John Stewart Curry was also a regionalist, but he never went to New York, okay? He spent his time, he did go to Paris in 1926. All good artists went to Paris in those days, okay? Just to be exposed to the various new wave of cubism and abstract expressionism and etc. You had to be exposed to it, be part of that art scene in Paris. Now, he was an artist in residence at the Agricultural School of the University of Wisconsin, having been born in Kansas. He had many murals, many mural commissions followed. And here, in this work, he portrays a Midwestern farmer, the heroism of the Midwestern farmer. Scenes of with the tornado coming and this huge black cloud, and he is trying to save his family, taking them down into the tornado cellar. And of course, this was part of one of the tornadoes, and the drought was the reason for the creation of the Dust Bowl, and the farmers who had to abandon their homes and their farms and simply drive west. So this, of course, was wonderfully stated in the movie about the Okies with Henry Fonda in The Grapes of Wrath. All right, now here is something called Tragic Prelude. This was done in 1937, and it is filled with fire and fury. It portrays John Brown's raids in Kansas as a prelude to the Civil War. It was not well received by Kansans, by the way. The heroic, if manic, figure of Brown dominates the painting smack dab in the middle, with his arms thrown out as if he were a savior, with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. The gun, by the way, went by the sobriquet of Beecher's Bibles. The tornado is a symbol of woe as the settlers head west to escape the fiery Holocaust. And of course, we can also see a vignette of a battle, a Civil War battle. Now here's another one that Curry did, was commissioned by Life magazine to do this painting in 1940 that documented the 1927 Mississippi River flood. Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce at the time. And what we have here is really a pastiche, because Curry had gone to witness what was happening. Meanwhile, you can see a number of black people who are on a raft being rescued. There are animals that are falling into the water and drowning. Herbert Hoover is there with his entourage, and it is being photographed. And in the foreground, there is a mother sitting with her child, with her baby, nursing her child. And off to the right, there is a first aid station. And if you look very closely in the lower right, you will see a nurse covering the body of a victim. In other words, what he did was he took incidents from a number of different places and he put them all together to create an overview of all that had happened in the 1927 flood. Emotions are over the top in this, as with Tragic Prelude, but there is great sympathy for the suffering. Now, Curry this is his next work that I'm showing you, totally different than what I just showed you. For 6 weeks, this is very interesting. Curry, in 1936, for 6 weeks, Curry ran away with the Ringling Circus. Well, obviously a fulfillment of a childhood dream. He did many paintings, including the Flying Wallendas, who were trapeze artists for a number of generations. I could not get a reproduction of this work as they are privately owned and would not work with my PowerPoint presentation. This is a lithograph of the circus elephants, and you can see what a very skilled illustrator he was. Now, you know, a lithograph is etched on a plate, and then the plate is inked, and the paper is put on the plate. And then the plate, the paper, after being pressed down with a press, an actual metal press, the paper is then lifted off, and you have the mirror image that appears on the plate. In other words, if you want the elephant with the trunk that's on the right, you have to put him on the plate on the left, and then you get a mirror image. Now, the next group of people we're going to be talking about are the social realists. These are artists who, shall we say, were born around the turn of the century and came to maturity right about the time that the stock market declined, the turmoil with the loss of jobs, people wandering the streets and whatnot, looking for work, looking for food, so they felt very strongly. They were very sympathetic toward what was happening, and they realized that their art was a way of expressing their sympathy and also showing others the sufferings that are occurring in our country. Now, this first one is by Moses Sawyer. He and his brother Raphael were both members of the WPA, and this is Moses' painting of artists in a studio. There are panels there. They are painting. There is also the presence of 3 women, indicating that WPA was fair to both sexes. The quality of the work varies, yet it was a definitive step forward in supporting art. This is one of the few actual paintings of artists at work during the WPA, though I know many pictures were taken of the WPA because naturally the government wanted to know what was happening with it. The next one is one by his brother Raphael, called The Mission. And this is another lithograph, okay? This is another lithograph etched on a plate, inked over, and then pulled with a piece of paper placed over it, and then it's pulled off. Now, this is a lithograph of unemployed men having a simple repast. It looks like there's a cup of coffee and perhaps a piece of bread for them. This image represents what was happening throughout the country. The men's faces are in shadow. They don't communicate with each other, but you can see the desperation that is in their face. But they don't share that with anyone else. In other words, societal norms were different in the 1930s. If you had a problem, you did not, shall we say, tell everybody about the problem, and there were no hugs. That was not, you had to be stoical about your situation and not complain. Now, the next one is another one by Sawyer called Office Girls from 1936. Women in the workforce. One did not give up a job if you were lucky to have one in the 1930s. And these women obviously are headed for secretarial work, perhaps working in the store, etc. And yet, if you look on the left, in the shadows, where the dark panel is, there is a man, a care woman, workman, looking as the others go to work. They're not paying any attention to them because they are geared up, to get to the office and get to that typewriter. But it tells us, what he's telling us was, desperation was closer than you think. Because in many cases, you had a job on Friday and Monday you were jobless. So this is what he is saying here, and it's very effectively done, I think. Now, here, let's see now. All right, there's another one he did. The craggy, called Unemployed. The craggy face and sad eyes almost blend with the background. For the forgotten, in other words, he is an exemplar of the forgotten men in our country. We know there were many marches on Washington, especially with World War I veterans, who said, wait a minute, I fought for this country. I fought in the war. I was injured. I'm back, and now I don't have a job. Now, But this is, again, another sympathetic portrayal of hopelessness. Now, another man named Jack Levine also was a social realist. But in contrast to Sawyer's work, Levine's work is stinging, vitriolic satire. Here we see three men, rotund, in other words, they're fat cats, okay, with animalistic smugness, animalistic smug expressions on their faces. They are portraying the criminals. They are the criminals of the 1930s who carried on as usual despite the efforts of law enforcement. The criminal element thrived even after the repeal of Prohibition that had given rise to the mob element. And we know the mob has been very, very difficult to stamp out ever since. Now, so he paints them. I mean, it's almost like he's dipped his pen, his brush in poison, all right? And there they are, smug, well-dressed, with cigars and cigarettes and whatnot. And their faces are distorted because the evil in these men is shown in their faces. All right, now let's look at one called Welcome Home. And this is a very sarcastic title from 1946. What we see are overfed, corrupt individuals. Note the title, Welcome Home. They have not fought for the war. They have simply benefited from it, no doubt with black market, racketeering, etc. Levine also includes a general with a huge medal on his chest, and there they are all sharing a repast with champagne, no doubt, and a lady there with, shall we say, a very, well, not looking so much like a lady as someone's mistress from the way she is dressed. And she is very, very attenuated. She is really skinny, almost skeletal. And that too it's repulsive. It's repulsive. And it is meant to repulse you. It is not meant to entertain or laugh at. It is meant to repulse you. Now, social realism, with his outraged imposed on the subject matter. Thus, he is expressionist. He is expressing what he feels about these people. Levine was to live until 2010, and many of the WPA artists were socialists, and some may have been communists. But given the politics of the 30s, this was not unusual. There was a strong communist movement in the country in the 1930s. Many were still enthralled to the Russian Revolution as extolled by John Reed, the American writer, who, by the way, is the only American buried in the Kremlin. Okay, now let's look at another one here. Here we have again. Levine never lost his edge. Here are the winners, and we are the losers. The entire scene is replete with corruption. With the fat cats, their overdressed wives or mistresses, the cigarette girl dressed as a prostitute. Nothing changed in his nocturnal, shadowy colors, all right? And they are all celebrating. They are all having a grand time for themselves. This is from 1954 now. But he still portrays the corrupt politician who got elected with various and sundry little tricks here and there. Now, the next one, Levine still, Under the L from 1952. Now here, Levine has changes his style a little bit. The colors are really sharp and broken, and there's almost a cubist, one layer of color on top of the other, with strong black lines delineating the figures. Two men are outside a pawn shop in the Lower East Side, probably the Bowery. One has emerged with money in his hand, while the other one turns to enter. So he is portraying, even in the 1950s, the seamy side of life of the underclass and downtrodden with which Levine always identified himself. Another one here. Now here is where he did a seriograph, that is a poster, for the CIO, which was the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It's a public interest message. It's straightforward. The image is readily understandable because it has got two fists there, all right, exhorting and the fists are of black men, exhorting the blacks to vote, the only way that reactionaries' grip can be loosened. It was a prescient image because the battle for civil rights began after the Second World War, where the blacks began pushing for their rights. After all, they fought and they died just as the same as the whites did, and they felt that they had now had earned their place in American society. Now the next one I'm going to show you is Ben Shahn. Levine and Ben Shahn, I mean, they could have been cousins, or they could have been buddies, because we get the same feelings that Levine put in his work with Ben Shahn, only it's a little bit stepped back. Okay, now look at this. This is called The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti from 1931. Sacco and Vanzetti were accused of murdering a postal employee. American intellectuals and socialists rallied to the cause of two Italian anarchists accused of the murder. They barely spoke English, and the trial was racist, and despite protests, they were later executed. Shahn places them before a justice building. Now realize the entire court procedure was done in English, and these two poor little Italian guys didn't really know. They knew that they were on trial for murder, but they had no way to actually defend themselves at all. Now, these people are readily identifiable. In other words, Shahn didn't pull any punches there. The man in the middle is President Lowell of Harvard University, an avowed racist who encouraged quotas from Europe, especially Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. Now, he was also the chairman of the commission that reviewed the sentence. Flanking him is the president of MIT in the top hat, and the other man is a retired judge. Now, in the background, you see what looks like our Supreme Court building, or a court building, where Judge Webster Thayer is the one who presided over the trial, and he vowed to get those radical Italians. Okay, right there, there was prejudice for these two guys. Felix Frankfurter, who served in our Supreme Court, attempted to get their sentences overturned on the basis of questionable evidence. Now, this is a series of 23 paintings that Shahn made on the social issues of the time. The next one I'm going to show you is Shahn's The Riveter. Shahn and his wife, Bernarda Bryson Shahn, began a series of 13 murals for the Bronx Post Office entitled Resources of America. In other words, again, another project for the WPA. This is one of the panels showing labor as one of our resources. Now, I'm going to show you now another part of the mural. There's the mural in situ, meaning in the place. It's still in the building, the Bronx Post Office. Now, the building was for sale, but there was a movement to have the building was made into a national landmark. Okay, but the building went up for sale, and even though the building itself is a national landmark, the lobby is not, which means anyone who buys that can simply knock through that wall and destroy the painting, unfortunately. Now, the building exterior was declared, as I said, in 1976 as a national landmark, but not the lobby. I do not know what has happened, whether the building was ultimately sold. There was a big issue about it a few years ago, and I don't know what has happened to the building. Although it probably is still there, because the Times would have reported if it had been sold and the murals destroyed. This is another thing. With these murals, we are attempting to preserve them, to keep them. If you want to see some murals, go to Perth Amboy, to the Children's Library on Hobart Street, Hobart, I think, yes. And you will see murals there, little murals of fairy tales. And also, if you go to the old Perth Amboy High School, which is now the McGinnis School in Perth Amboy, right near the Five Corners. Can also go into their auditorium and see the murals that are still there. Now, when they renovated the school, they did not destroy those murals because, again, they are a historic artifact. So, now, let's look at another one here. Two posters by Sean. These artists did many, many posters, okay? They used the poster medium because they know they would be able to reach a much wider audience. Now, Sean had worked as Diego Rivera's assistant in the Rockefeller Center mural that was ordered destroyed by the Rockefellers because Diego Rivera had put next to George Washington a portrait of Vladimir Lenin. The Rockefeller brothers came in. They paid him the fee that he had asked. They told him to leave, and after he left, they got the workmen, and the mural was destroyed. However, Diego Rivera went back to Mexico and recreated the mural. Now, so Sean was an avowed liberal throughout his life. And in 1935, at the suggestion of the photographer Walker Evans, he also, that is to say, Sean also became a photographer for the Farm Services Administration, documenting the South and the migrants. The second poster on the left, The Years of Dust, advocates freedom of speech for all. And I'm sorry, that's on the right. I'm very sorry. Advocating freedom of speech for all, and shows the strongly worked lines with clenched fists and closed mouth and eyes bespeak of the tension produced when one cannot speak his own mind. All right, and now we will look at one more here. Register and vote. The voting poster was done after World War II to encourage blacks to register, and the title refers to blacks winning the right to fight in the war. It says it right there on the newspaper the man is reading. Now, they had fought in the war. Now they had to fight for their civil rights. Now, I alluded to photography. Photography was very, very important during the 1930s, because many photographers, first of all, Walker Evans, for example, worked for Life magazine, but there were many other photographers who were hired by the WPA to chronicle the Dust Bowl, the poverty of the South, perhaps even the building of the. They have a lot of film of the building of the Empire State Building, and also to chronicle the lives of the migrant workers in California as well. And the next person I'm going to talk about is Dorothy Lange, a woman photographer who, born in 1895, who was one of the WPA. First, she worked for the California Relief Agency. Then she worked for the WPA. Now, I put her in because, of course, I want to show the part that women took, but also because Dorothy Lange was born in Hoboken, New Jersey. And when she was 7 years old, she got polio. And at the age of 12, the father abandoned the family. But she went on to study photography at Columbia University and also at a studio in San Francisco. Now, she spoke of her polio this way, because it did leave her crippled. Quote, "It formed me, guided me, instructed me, and helped me, and humiliated me." She once said of her altered gait, in other words, she couldn't walk correctly, "I've never gotten over it, and I am aware of the force and power of it." Now, in 1920, she married a Western artist named Maynard Dixon. And by 1934, she was taking photographs in California with Paul Taylor, a sociologist from the University of California at Berkeley, for the California Relief Agency. And she had broken up with her husband and married Taylor in 1935. Now, In 1935, she's working for the Farm Services Administration, documenting rural poverty for the next 5 years with photos and data gathering. In other words, it just wasn't photographs. You had to have data backing it up to present it to the government so the government could hopefully do something for these people. Now, she had an assistant named Ron Partridge, and she was allowed $4 a day for expenses for herself and Ron Partridge, which included gasoline, food, and lodging, where they worked primarily in the Imperial Valley of California. In June of 1937, Life magazine ran one of her pictures uncredited in an article on the Dust Bowl. Now, her pictures were done, as you can see, she has the camera there, a very large camera. But professional photographers, such as she was, use a procedure known as the gelatin silver print. You use a light-sensitive paper that's got silver halide on it in a gel solution, which is then rinsed off in processing, leaving the silver image to be printed on paper, which also contains silver halides. Now, the reason being is because you could get very nuanced. It's only black and white, but you could get nuances between the black and white, dark gray, medium gray, light gray, etc. This is the reason why this particular procedure is still used with professional photographers today. Now, this is the first one I'm going to show you. I am sure you have seen many, many times. It's called The Migrant Mother. Her name was Florence Thompson, even though at that time she did not ask the woman's name, from 1936. And this is her description of the way she photographed this picture. And she described it to Popular Photography in an interview in 1960, 5 years before she died. I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food. There she sat in that lean-to tent with her children huddled around her and seemed to know that my picture might help her, and so she helped me. There was a sort of equality. Now, this is the height of desperation. Why would you sell the tires from your car? Obviously, she had no gasoline in it, and she hoped to be able to buy some food for her children, who are just clinging to their mother, living in an insecure situation, clinging to their mother and hiding their faces. So this is the epitome of what happened. I can't add anything to this picture. I simply cannot. There's nothing else I can say about it, or I should say about it, because it says it all by itself. Now, the next one is called Child and Mother. This was taken in the Yakima Valley of Washington in 1939. The mother and the child are placed far away from each other, giving a sense of isolation and hopelessness. The wire fence, that barbed wire fence, is emblematic of their plight. They are caught, they have nowhere to go. Lange would ask, here's what she would do. She would ask the people, always ask them, may I take your picture? Because I think she didn't want to destroy whatever dignity they had left. If they agreed, she wouldn't take the picture. She'd walk away and come back a little while later and then take the picture, because she didn't want them posing with a smile on their face, okay? She didn't want that. That would not indicate anything about the struggles of these people. So, now here's another one. This is from Alabama, a Crossword Store in Alabama in 1937. This picture captures another America. Note the antiquated gas pump, and I know that these now are avidly picked up by antique collectors, believe it or not. And all the ads for cigarettes, all those posters there, all for cigarettes. In all these photos, the people seemed to be waiting it out because there was nothing they could do. Notice the porch is held up with stones, and in the front we have a cadre of a few black men sitting and waiting. Meanwhile, the storekeeper leans against the door jamb, and he also is standing and waiting. All right, again, showing the abject misery of this particular time. All right, now here's another one. Two of them, as a matter of fact. One called The Damaged Child from Elk Grove, Oklahoma in 1936, and The Ex-Slave with Long Memory from Alabama in 1937. Look at the child on the left. She's hurt. She needs medical attention and food and maybe a new dress, okay? Behind her is probably a tar paper building with whatever paint, with it appears to be falling apart. It's very ramshackle, which also needs attention. This is the reason why he put her there. The child and the building need equal attention. The old woman is still tending the fields. There's no Social Security. Now, it became a law in 1935, but I don't know if this woman was eligible for Social Security in 1937. Now, it's titled Ex-Slave with Long Memory, which means she must have been born into slavery and would at this point in 1937 probably been in her mid-70s, okay? Now, the next one. Jobless on the edge of a pea field in the Imperial Valley of California. There is a defiance of these men for whom there is no work. Notice on both sides there are elbows of two other people, so there must be a string of people squatting there. The horizon line is very high, and it begins right at the man's neck. In other words, his body is kind of overtaken by the pasture, but only his head is above it, okay? Now, the high horizon line with furrows that stretch on into infinity. Now, Lange's first husband, as I told you, was an artist, and he must have stressed the importance of composition for her, because her composition is always absolutely masterful. Lange was also apprenticed to a number of New York photo studios, including the well-known studio of Arnold Genthy, who was a famous photographer at the time. But her compositions can just absolutely strike you dumb. Look at this one, Tractored Out, Childress County, Texas, 1938. A masterful composition with this abandoned farmhouse in the distance, which looks like a little dollhouse, almost overwhelmed by the path, the tractor paths. Or was it the Dust Bowl that dug out those furrows? It's entirely possible, because sometimes those dust storms would last for 2 or 3 days, and in some cases, if a person died and was buried, the next day or 2 or 3 days later, if they went back, they couldn't find where the burial spot was, because there were such dust storms that would just blew hundreds of tons of dust and earth. And of course, it eroded the topsoil, so even if you wanted to farm, you couldn't get a good crop. You couldn't get a meaningful crop. So, did the Dust Bowl actually etch these furrows? Maybe. But is it the natural, or is it the natural erosion of something that's already there? Now, I'm going to show you one more picture by her, and this, I think, is her masterpiece. Yes, the one of the homeless woman is the most famous, but this one is beyond belief. By the way, there was, at the Metropolitan in January and February, an exhibition of the works of Dorothy Lange. Unfortunately, I couldn't get there. I could not get there at all. But this is called Woman of High Plains, Texas, in 1939. There it is. This sad, thin, despairing woman becomes monumental, yet vulnerable, outlined against the sky. Note how the cloud formation actually echoes the placement of her elbow. She may have very well have seen that cloud and asked her, "Would you move over a few inches, please?" Just absolutely masterful. Her dress is threadbare from so many washings. It's clean, but she needs another dress, and I also think she probably needs a nice three-course meal. Note the strong arms used to the hard work, but she appears almost on the verge of tears, with the hand to the forehead and the desperation of what am I going to do now? She is old before her time, but she is the monumental woman that exemplified the 1930s. I just, looking at this just breaks your heart. It really, really does. And it's supposed to. You are supposed to feel what these people are feeling. Now, we're going to go on with abstract expressionism. Remember, I mentioned to you at the beginning of the lecture that we were going to talk about Thomas Hart Benton at the beginning and also at the end of the lecture, because I'm going to go into to discuss briefly two artists who were part of the WPA project, but also became very, very successful afterward, as did, let's say, Achille Gorky. And the first one I'm going to talk about is Jackson Pollock. Now this, here, abstract expressionist. Now here is an early work by Pollock that Benton donated to the Smithsonian Institute, all right? This is called Going West from 1934, when Pollock was, again, a student of Benton. Pollock was born in 1912 in Wyoming to an alcoholic father who abandoned the family when he was 8 years old. Again, abandonment. He was a needy child but got very little attention. In 1930, he went to New York City with his older brother Charles, and both of them studied with Thomas Hart Benton, who became for Jackson a father figure, got him to focus his energy. What he could not do was to stop him from drinking, which led to violent fights. As a matter of fact, at one time, he even threatened his sister-in-law with an axe. But Benton and his wife, Rita, let him move into their New York apartment. And as a matter of fact, Jackson Pollock fell in love with Rita. In 1936, Benton is in Missouri, and Pollock again was living in their apartment. Now, in 1935 is when WPA hired him, paying him $24.86 per week for 20 hours of work as a stone cutter. Jackson Pollock was a very strong man. In 1937, to try and cure himself of his alcoholism, he went into Jungian therapy to try and, again, cure the alcoholism. Meanwhile, by 1940, he was recognized for his genius. And a woman by the name of Lee Krasner, who was an artist, she married him. And she took him out of New York City and away from his drinking buddies out to the Hamptons. And the Hamptons in those days, in 1937, 38, was still potato fields, okay? So they went there with the idea that he would have a studio where he could work and there would be peace and calm. This was approximately 1940, okay? Now, but he could not deal with fame. He even derided Benton, saying he had to unlearn everything Benton taught him. Now, this was a man and his wife who had taken him in and taken care of him, took care of him, and tried desperately for a number of years to turn his life around. Now, finally, Lee Krasner, after a number of years being married to him, in 1956, she left him and went to Paris because Lee Krasner was an artist and she had put her artwork on hold because she realized what a genius Jackson Pollock was. Now, Jackson Pollock's mother then came to the Hamptons to, again, take care of him and, cook and whatnot. Jackson Pollock had a brand new girlfriend in 1956, and on August the 11th of 1956, he went to the train station to pick her up in his convertible automobile. His girlfriend had come down with a friend from New York City. And the friend said to the girlfriend, "Gee, I don't want to get in the car with him. He's drunk." And the lady said, his girlfriend said, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's okay." Well, on the way back to the house, Pollock had an accident, which the impact of which was so great that it threw his body 50 feet up into a tree. The passenger was killed, but the girlfriend survived. So, all right. Now, this early work, as I said, was donated by Benton to the Smithsonian. He was told of Pollock's death by another artist, Willem de Kooning, but he was so distraught that he could not attend Jackson Pollock's funeral. His expressive abilities here, as you can see, astonish one, even with the prosaic subject matter of a wagon train going through the mountains. The wagon train through the mountains, dark, surrounded by darkness and enveloped in a circle of darkness, but lit by a feeble moon, creates a vortex just thrumming with emotion. In other words, Jackson Pollock took out all his emotions on the brush, on the paint that he was doing. Now here is another one. This is from 1941. Figure composition. Here is where he comes under the influence of Picasso, whose work he saw at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm sorry, the Museum of Modern Art, I'm very sorry. These biomorphic amoeba-like fig forms were also used by Achille Gorky and João Miro, the Portuguese artist. These forms writhe on the canvas. The paint is thickly applied, giving texture that adds to the emotion. Now, again, it's very difficult. How do you interpret this? You don't. You just have to look at it and try to take it in, okay? Now, look at this one. In 1942, something called the Stenographic Figure. It was shown at the Peggy Guggenheim Salon for Young Artists. She pronounced it dreadful. But Pete Mondrian was to say, something very important is happening here. Mondrian was an artist from the 1920s whose works can be seen at the Museum of Modern Art. Now, art historians do not agree if there is one or two figures. If you look on the right, there is a very attenuated figure that supposedly that has been identified as a male. And on the left, you will see what has been called an all-providing, castrating female. Stella, that is to say, Jackson Pollock's mother, was transformed into a domestic harridan. Other historians believe that the nude figure was inspired by Picasso or Matisse. The woman with claw-like hands reaches across the table to the male. Is it to give something or to grasp the figure in its claws? The male figure itself is very emaciated and is almost like attenuated, emaciated, and powerless. To add additional ambiguities, the work is replete with childlike scrawls, including a tic-tac-toe design, which negates the scariness of this. There's a tic-tac-toe in the middle, okay? Now, note the mask-like demented face of the female. Pollock was in therapy at this time, as you know, which emphasizes archetypes drawn from the deepest levels of the psyche. But those squiggles that you see all over the painting, those squiggles were to morph into his famous drip paintings. Now I'm going to show you another one. This one is much easier to read. It's called War from 1947, clearly influenced by Picasso's Guernica and the images that appeared during and after World War II. A human figure and an animal are tossed and about to be impaled upon the shards of a bombed-out building or bridge girders that have already claimed lives. Notice the skulls within the rubble. There are skulls there. There are people who are dead. And everything is absolute chaos. The black web of lines kind of edge it out almost like a spider web. These are all caught in this black spider web. So, now, here is one of his drip paintings from 1948. It's called number 19. He numbered them, okay? This early work sold in May of 2013 for $58.3 million. But But in in the previous 20 years, in May of 1993, it had sold for $2.4 million. So it appreciated as well as, let's say, Amazon stock would, or even better, I should say. The mesh-like net is created by tossing paint onto the canvas with a brush, a stick, or any other object. The canvas is called action painting. The canvas is on the floor because the drips have to remain where he put them, because if you put it on an easel, the drips would simply run down the canvas, all right? The action painting is a canvas on the floor with Pollock walking around it, stopping, putting some drips, moving over, stopping. We know this because there is a short film clip made in the 1950s of Pollock working, all right? Now, it may look haphazard, but Pollock was in control of his medium. An artist always has to control his medium, all right? Which was, believe it or not, house paint. Now, this adds another layer of problems with these paintings. Many of them are quite old now, but in order to restore it, you have to find house paint, and you've got to try to find, well, the manufacturer, if their company is still around, and find paint that will match that, you see. So there are problems with this. Now, the traditional subject matter is gone. The traditional 3 dimensions are gone. All you have is a flat surface of canvas with the emotions and displayed on the canvas. Subject matter is gone. There is only the artist and his medium imposing on the canvas his will or his unconscious. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "There is no reality except action. Man exists only to the extent that he fulfills himself." Now here's another one. This one is quite lovely, I think. It's called Lavender Mist from 1950. The title was suggested by the critic Clement Greenberg, a friend of Pollock's, and Pollock accepted it. He had called it number 1 1950, to identify it as his first painting for 1950. There is no lavender in this painting, however. It consists of black, white, stone blue, silver, and orange, but it has a misty quality. It's lyrical in its use of color and the thread-like web that spreads across the canvas. It may look accidental, but it's anything but, all right? But this effect could only be created with skill, concentration, and the control of your material. There is a sense of movement as one tries to follow the lines. It is vibrant, but it denies the 3-dimensional reality of the Renaissance. It actually thrums. It's vibrant, but there is no, it's flat. There is no 3D reality, 3-dimensional, as it's explored by the artists of the Renaissance. The work, by the way, can be hung in any way, and the meaning remains the same. I mean, you could turn it upside down, sideways, put it at a slant if you want. It remains the same. Now, I'm going to close with looking at some more work by a woman artist who was a member of the WPA project, and I wanted to include a woman. Her work is at the Metropolitan Museum, her work is at the MoMA Museum, so you can look for it there. Her name was Lauren MacIver. She was born in 1909, and by the age of 10, she was taking art classes at the Art Students League on Saturday mornings. This is how very, very clever she was. And in 1927, at the National Academy of Design. In 1929, she married Lloyd Frankenberg, a poet, and her works began showing in New York galleries. But in 1935, she was with the WPA despite her success in exhibiting independently. In 1928, she had her first solo exhibit. And Stieglitz, the great Alfred Stieglitz, who owned a gallery in New York, wrote of her, "This girl should be given a chance to paint," unquote. And Pierre Matisse said, "She is a woman painter who paints like a woman, not a man. She does not belong to a school of art, but is an independent artist." At the time, the Museum of Modern Art was relatively new, and Alfred Barr was the director. And he bought 2 of her works, one which he kept for himself and one for the Museum of Modern Art. This work shows the influence of Paul Klee, which she acknowledged. What we see here is a crowded urban scene with tiny houses tilted at odd angles and with a central green space with a stick figure pushing a baby carriage. The paint has a transparency. In other words, she must have mixed the paint with turpentine to thin it out, all right? Give it a transparency. And this quality you see in many of her works. And it adds to it almost a childlike quality, almost like it was done by a little girl. MacIver and her husband lived in Greenwich Village, and this is a scene she no doubt saw downstairs. By the way, she died in 1998, so she had a very long life indeed. Now, the next one here is called Key West Arrangement from 1939. This is a pen and ink and pastel crayon on paper. The delicacy of the pastel with the palm tree, the fence, the shell, and the flower with the table are haphazard, though it is a remembrance of a recent trip. Just as if you had recently gone on a trip, you might remember the cup of coffee you had in Paris, the red bus ride you took in London, etc. Little fragments of memory is what she's showing here to give you a picture of what the trip was like. The blue of the sea, the pink of the flowers, and the green for the profusion of plants that one sees only in Key West is very evocative. Now, Key West was noted as an artist colony and still is, and was also famous for being the residence of Hemingway and also Truman's Southern White House when he was president. Now here, the sidewalk of 1940. By 1940, MacIver's career had blossomed with a solo exhibition at the Baltimore Museum, also at MoMA and another exhibition, and her mural commissions. She had mural commissions for 2 cruise ships, the SS Argentina and the American Export Line cruises, and artists would look forward to something like this because it was guaranteed income, and it also gave their work a wider audience. There were 2 versions of this work. The children's game is scratched onto chalk on a stained and cracked sidewalk with no human presence, just the hopscotch, okay? The chalk marks would wash away in the rain, removing any suggestion of a presence. Or does the pattern derive from mythic labyrinths? Hopscotch has many variations, as you know, including a circular one where you would claim a square as your own and the other person would have to jump over it, thus making it very difficult. Thus, an innocent game takes on a dangerous aspect, and an aspect of it's here today and gone tomorrow. Completed during World War II, it could refer to the thousands of children who were lost. She said of this, "Certain moments have the gift of revealing the past and foretelling the future. It is these moments that I hope to catch." And here is her next one. This is also from 1945, and it is called Votive Lights. Again, we see a very, very thinly painted, so that it has almost a transparency. The votive light stands are common in Catholic churches, where candles are lit for the loved ones, dead or alive, and a prayer is said. During World War II, her husband was a pacifist and worked at a mental hospital, returning back home in 1945. The lighted candles are symbolic of the Holy Spirit, so it can be interpreted as an anti-war painting for the souls who have been lost. The next one. This one is New York at night. Apartment windows shine in the background with the neon lit objects such as the leaf, the key, the eyeglasses, a lobster, a shoe, a hat, and a brioche. As the L train lumbers by taking a curve. Well, this really is an old painting because, of course, there is no longer an elevated railway in New York. It was all taken down. All of this is seen through a rainy haze. She was fascinated, as many artists were, with the electric wonderland that New York City becomes at night. As a matter of fact, even Georgia O'Keeffe did paintings of nocturnal New York. In 1948, she had gone to Europe where she painted many Parisian scenes, and until 1990 she was represented by Pierre Matisse at the Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York City. She was never a part of the women's art movement, always maintained her independence. And she wrote, "My wish is to make something permanent out of the transitory." And of course, this is transitory. The rain, the speeding train, the lights will go out in the morning. So it's transitory. She captures it at a moment in time. Now, the last one I'm going to show you here is Manhattan from 1959. Her renown in the New York art world at that time was eclipsed only by Georgia O'Keeffe, and in this very geometric work we can see a similarity with O'Keeffe's paintings of the New York City nocturnal scenes. We are allowed to look between the buildings, whose stone has the grit that slowly ages the buildings, leading to unnecessary sandblasting. She wrote of herself, "I never intended to be a painter. I just like to paint." I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today in this lecture, and I certainly hope that it gave you a little bit of respite and a little bit of enjoyment. Thank you again. Goodbye.